In the spring of 1223, 20,000 Mongol horsemen appeared in the southern Russian steppes, resembling a dark cloud drifting over the endless plains. For weeks, they advanced deep into enemy territory. The Russian commanders observing them could not comprehend what they saw. No supply wagons, no baggage, no visible food reserves, only men on small horses, moving faster than any army had the right to move. A Russo-Cuman coalition gathered 80,000 warriors, 4 times the number of the Mongols. They had everything an army required: wagons groaning with grain and salted meat, herds of livestock for fresh provisions, artisans for equipment repair, a logistical network stretching to their cities. This was how civilized warfare was waged. This was how an army was sustained in the field. The Mongol forces under General Subutai had none of this. They covered 60, sometimes 100 miles a day, traversing seemingly impassable terrain and functioning in conditions where they should have starved within a week. Russian commanders sent scouts to the Mongol camp at night. The reports were nonsensical. The Mongols weren't unloading supplies. They were simply drinking something from leather bags. And in the morning, they would mount their horses and cover incredible distances again. Where is their food? One Russian prince reportedly asked his advisors. No one had an answer. But what the Russian commanders, what no one understood until the Mongol Empire conquered half the known world, failed to grasp, was that the Mongols had discovered something revolutionary. They had turned what everyone considered their greatest weakness into the most destructive military advantage in human history. The answer wasn't in what they carried, but in what they rode. And once you understand that answer, once you see how completely the Mongols rewrote the rules of war, you will never think about military logistics the same way again. Let me explain why the Mongol army never needed food supplies when conquering the world. To understand why the Mongol system seemed impossible, you must understand how every other army functioned in the 10th century. Because by the standards of the time, what the Mongols were doing was sheer madness. European armies moved like snails, carrying their homes on their backs. A typical force of 10,000 men required hundreds of supply wagons, each pulled by oxen or horses that themselves needed 20 pounds of grain per day. Grain for the soldiers, grain for the animals pulling the grain, fodder for the cavalry horses, spare wheels, blacksmiths, bakers, butchers. An army was not just soldiers. It was a moving city of logistical personnel, often outnumbering the fighters themselves. This system had rules, ironclad rules that everyone understood. You couldn't travel more than 15 or 20 miles a day because the wagons couldn't keep up. You had to follow roads, as wagons couldn't traverse rough terrain. Your route was predictable, as you needed to stay near towns where you could requisition or acquire more supplies. And you were vulnerable, desperately vulnerable, because if enemy forces cut your supply lines, your army would disintegrate within days. The Chinese were even more sophisticated. Their armies during the Song dynasty had perfected the art of military logistics, organized warehouses, systematic resupply, rice shipments coordinated over hundreds of miles. They could field massive armies and keep them fed through meticulous planning and infrastructure. It was impressive, it was complex, it was a sign of advanced civilization. And it was all based on one fundamental assumption: an army marches on its stomach. This phrase, often attributed to Napoleon 5 centuries later, reflected what everyone in the medieval world knew to be true. Logistics meant civilization, supply lines meant power. The more sophisticated your supply system, the more powerful your army. Then came the Mongols, pastoral nomads from the steppes north of China. They had no towns, no agriculture, no infrastructure. Their way of life seemed primitive to the civilized observer. They lived in felt yurts that could be loaded onto wagons. They moved with the seasons, following the grass for their herds. They drank fermented mare's milk and, according to horrifying accounts from visitors, even the blood of their horses in times of hardship. When Mongol envoys first appeared at the Chinese and Middle Eastern courts, the sophisticated diplomats of these empires saw exactly what they expected to see. Barbarians, fierce fighters, yes, dangerous raiders, certainly, but fundamentally limited by their primitive lifestyle. They could strike fast and disappear back into the steppe, but they couldn't wage long campaigns. They couldn't besiege cities. They couldn't project power over vast distances. European military theorists, if they bothered to analyze the Mongols at all, saw the same limitations. These small Mongol horses seemed weak compared to the massive European war horses. The Mongols lacked visible supply infrastructure. They seemed to survive on almost nothing. The consensus among all military experts, from Paris to Baghdad, was unequivocal. The Mongols, perhaps excellent raiders, lacked the logistical capacity for sustained warfare. They would starve as soon as they left the steppe pastures. Their primitive lifestyle was considered a fundamental weakness that would forever limit their military potential. This opinion persisted right up until the moment the Mongols conquered the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Because, as it turned out, every military expert in the civilized world was catastrophically, stunningly wrong. Here's what no one understood. When the Mongols set out to conquer the world, there was only one limiting factor for their military operations. Not food, not water, not supplies, but grass. I know that sounds absurd. Grass, that was the secret, but hear me out, because it changes everything. Think about what slowed down European and Chinese armies. It wasn't the soldiers. Soldiers can march 30 kilometers a day if necessary. What slowed those armies down was feeding the horses. A war horse requires 9 to 14 kilograms of grain per day. Not grass, but grain, oats, barley, prepared fodder. This grain had to be grown, harvested, stored, transported, and distributed. The entire cumbersome machine of medieval logistics existed primarily to feed horses. Mongol horses were different, fundamentally biologically different. They were not the massive war horses of European knights, or the prized steeds of Chinese cavalry. Mongol horses were small, perhaps 14 hands at the withers, stocky, with thick coats. To civilized eyes, they looked like ponies, almost comically small. But these animals had evolved on the Central Asian steppes for millennia and possessed abilities that made them the most effective military steeds in history. The Mongol horse could survive entirely on grass, not special grass, not cultivated fodder, but just any grass it could find, including grass buried under snow, that it would dig out with its hooves. And these horses lived outdoors year-round in temperatures ranging from negative 40 degrees Celsius in winter to 30 degrees Celsius in summer. They needed no stables, no grain, no human care whatsoever. Do you realize what that meant? Do you realize how that changed everything? A European army needed to carry its horse feed or stay near sources where it could be obtained. This created supply lines, a logistical tail, a predictable route. A Mongol army needed only a steppe with grass, and pastures covered roughly 1/5 of the Earth's landmass, forming an almost continuous belt from Hungary to Korea. The Mongol Empire was not built on roads or supply depots. It was built on grass. It was literally an empire powered by the sun. Grass grows from sunlight. Horses eat grass. Mongols ride horses. The entire military machine ran on photosynthesis. Compare this to later empires. The British Empire ran on wind, dependent on ships and trade winds. The American Empire runs on oil, on fossil fuels extracted, refined, and distributed through complex infrastructure. The Mongols needed none of that. Their energy source grew ubiquitously in the wild, wherever they needed to go. But here's where it gets really interesting, because this system had a limitation that actually made the Mongols more dangerous, not less. Pasture land could only support a certain number of grazing animals. Even the richest steppes would be depleted if 100,000 horses tried to graze in one place. This meant that Mongol armies could not move as a single, concentrated mass. They had to spread out, sometimes over hundreds of miles, breaking into independent columns that provisioned themselves. To European and Chinese commanders, this looked like chaos. It looked like a weakness that could be exploited. A divided army could be defeated in pieces, destroyed piecemeal. Except that the Mongols had organized their society for centuries around this very problem. They had a system, and that system turned a perceived weakness into their signature tactical advantage. Contemporaries described it again and again in accounts from Russia, China, Persia, and Hungary. They said the Mongols were everywhere at once, not consecutively, not one after another, but everywhere at once. Multiple Mongol columns coordinated across distances where coordination should have been impossible, converging on objectives simultaneously from different directions. In 1241, Mongol forces fought the Hungarians and Poles in Eastern Europe while simultaneously conducting operations against Korea on the opposite side of Asia. The same military system operated across 5,000 miles. Grass made it possible. The necessity of dispersing for grazing had devastating tactical consequences, and the horses that ate that grass were the key to everything else. Let me tell you about Mongol horses. because until you understand these animals, you cannot understand how the Mongol military system functioned. Mongol children learned to ride before they could walk. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. At the age of 3, a child was strapped to a horse's saddle, securely fastened so they wouldn't fall, and the horse was led around the camp. The child learned balance, picked up the rhythm of the horse's movement, and internalized that sitting astride was as natural as standing on the ground. By the age of 5, the straps were removed, and the child rode freely. By the age of 5, they had their own bow. By their teenage years, they could ride for days on end, sleep in the saddle, and shoot accurately at a full gallop. This was not military training. It was simply childhood on the steppe. Every Mongol was a cavalryman from birth, and the horses they rode were remarkable creatures that served far more functions than mere transport. Every Mongol warrior on campaign had 4 to 6 horses. Some sources suggest elite units had up to 18 horses per man, though this seems exaggerated. The standard was likely 5 or 6, mostly mares with a few geldings. A warrior would switch horses throughout the day, riding one while others followed him, unburdened, changing every few hours to keep his mounts fresh. This is how they covered those impossible distances. 60 miles a day was not uncommon. 100 miles was possible in emergencies. European knights could cover 20 miles in their heavy armor on their grain-fed war horses. Mongol cavalry was typically 3 to 5 times faster, but speed was only the beginning. These horses provided something far more important: food. The Mongols turned their horses into mobile food factories. Mare's milk was the foundation of this system. An adult mare produces 18 to 29 pints of milk per day, significantly more than a cow. In a society where most horses were female, this meant that every string of 5 horses per warrior produced nearly 15 gallons of milk daily. Now, here's the problem. Mongols, like most Central Asian peoples, suffered from lactose intolerance. They could not drink fresh milk without digestive upset, so they fermented it. The process was simple. Pour mare's milk into a large leather bag, usually made from a horse's hide. Hang the bag in your yurt. Everyone entering the yurt would stir the bag a few times with a wooden paddle. The constant stirring, combined with natural bacteria, fermented the milk over 2 to 3 days. The lactose broke down. What resulted, called kumis in some sources, a lightly carbonated, slightly alcoholic beverage that was the staple drink of the steppe. Arag typically contained 1 to 3% alcohol, about the same strength as weak beer. With various distillation processes, it could be concentrated to 6% or higher. This produced what the Mongols called black kumis, but even at low alcohol concentrations, the amount consumed was significant, and they drank in vast quantities. Historical accounts consistently describe Mongol drunkenness as excessive. One observer noted that when the Great Khan began to drink, a musician would strike an instrument, a servant would shout "Ha!" and everyone would drink together, clapping their hands and dancing. Drunkenness, according to numerous sources, was considered honorable among the Mongols. They drank to oblivion as a matter of course, especially during celebrations. Why is this important for military logistics? Because arag was incredibly calorie-dense and nutritious. A warrior could sustain himself on arag alone for extended periods. The fermentation process preserved the milk, made it portable, and turned it into something that wouldn't spoil for weeks. Every Mongol warrior carried leather bottles of arag, combined with a small amount of dried food. That was enough. But then there was another source, one that truly horrified civilized observers. Horse blood. I want you to understand that this was not a daily practice. It was not routine, but it was real. It was effective, and it solved a problem that would have stopped any other army dead in its tracks. When Mongol forces moved fast, pushing beyond normal endurance, traversing terrain where even hunting was difficult, they had an emergency food source that was literally beneath them. A warrior would select one of his horses, one that had not been ridden that day, and make a small incision in a vein, not deep, just enough to draw blood. He would take a few sips, perhaps half a pint, sometimes mixing it with water or arag to make it more palatable. Then he would seal the wound with herbs he carried for that purpose, or simply apply pressure until the bleeding stopped. The horse would lose perhaps a pint of blood, which would be easily replenished within a day. The injured horse would be rested until it fully recovered. The warrior, however, gained calories, iron, and protein without losing momentum. Kyriakos Ganjaketsi, an Armenian historian of the 10th century who was captured by the Mongols and served as a secretary, described this practice. He claimed that one healthy Mongol horse could provide daily meat rations for 100 men for a long time by this blood-drawing method. While that number seems exaggerated, a more plausible account from another contemporary states that a warrior could survive 10 days without hot food by consuming horse blood. It is important to grasp the strategic significance of this. A European army that ran out of provisions found itself in a critical situation. It had to stop, resupply, or retreat. A Mongol army facing a shortage of provisions merely slowed its pace slightly. Warriors began to draw blood from their spare horses, hunted more actively, gathered wild onions, garlic, and other edible plants. They continued to move, and only occasionally, at feasts, for special occasions, or when a horse died naturally and of old age, did they consume horse meat. This meat was highly prized. Mutton was commonplace, beef an acceptable option, but horse meat was considered a delicacy. One horse yielded approximately 108 kilograms of meat. Historical accounts of Mongol feasts mention that to provide provisions, gatherings of people would slaughter up to 90 horses, yielding about 9,000 kilograms of meat for 7,000 people. However, in everyday life, horses were rarely slaughtered for meat, as they were too valuable. They served simultaneously as transport, a source of milk, blood, and a breeding stock. They did not destroy their logistical system unless absolutely necessary. Instead, this system freed them from all the limitations faced by the other armies of the world. The Mongols moved with unprecedented speed, operated in inaccessible places, appeared where they were least expected, and waged campaigns of incredible duration. All of this was powered by grass, mare's milk, and occasional portions of blood from rotatably utilized hardy, small horses that European knights would have deemed unsuitable for serious combat. The Mongols understood what their enemies could not grasp. The best weapon system is not always the most powerful or complex. The best is the one that effectively works in the conditions of actual combat. These small, weak-looking horses were perfect. I don't want to give the impression that Mongol warriors carried no supplies at all. They did not ride around naked, living solely on milk and blood. They had provisions, but they were provisions suited for a mobile army. Each warrior carried a waterproof leather bag, carefully sealed and treated to protect against moisture. Inside this bag was his emergency ration, about 4.5 kilograms of dried milk curds, called kurut. Kurut was prepared by drying milk curds in the sun and wind until they were rock hard. It could be stored for months, even years. When needed, a piece was broken off, thrown into water, and within minutes, something resembling liquid yogurt was obtained. It was not fine dining, but kurut was portable, non-perishable, and highly calorie-dense. 4.5 kilograms of kurut could sustain a warrior for several weeks if necessary. Along with the dried curds, a warrior carried dried meat. The Mongols called it suzum. It was prepared by cutting meat into thin strips and drying it in the sun and wind, sometimes with salt if available, but more often without. The harsh, dry climate of the steppe naturally turned the meat into jerky. It was tough, chewy, and stored indefinitely. There is a famous story about Mongol warriors keeping strips of meat under their saddles while riding. The constant pressure and body heat of the horse tenderized the meat, making it edible. This story is thought to be the origin of steak tartare, named after the Tatars, an ethnic group often confused with the Mongols. Modern historians doubt the veracity of this tale. It seems the Mongols occasionally placed meat on their horses' backs for medicinal purposes, believing certain animal parts had healing properties, but not as a method of preparation. We know for certain that warriors carried jerky and could eat it raw, or boil it with any available wild vegetables to make a stew. Another type of dried meat, called boars, was specifically prepared for such purposes. Combined with wild onions and garlic, highly valued by the Mongols, a reasonably palatable meal could be prepared. And, of course, they carried kumis, fermented mare's milk, in leather skin bags. It provided both sustenance and morale. A warrior could spend days in the saddle with only dried curds, jerky, and kumis. The total weight of these provisions was minimal, perhaps around 9 kilograms, including water. Compare this to a European soldier carrying 22 to 36 kilograms of gear and depending on food wagons. The Mongols, however, did not rely solely on their rations. They constantly replenished their supplies through hunting and foraging. This is where their nomadic upbringing paid colossal dividends. Every Mongol was a hunter from childhood. They hunted on horseback with bows, acquiring food, providing entertainment, and honing their combat skills, as these activities demanded identical skills. Their prey included wolves, deer, foxes, and marmots, which they called Pharaoh's rats. According to Marco Polo's accounts, they also hunted birds. In critical situations, they could hunt and eat dogs. Hunting was so integral and constant a part of Mongol life that Genghis Khan eventually had to issue decrees restricting it during campaigns. His warriors exhausted their horses in pursuit of game when they should have been conserving their animals' energy for military action. This speaks to how natural and instinctive hunting was for these people. In addition to hunting, they actively engaged in foraging. Wild garlic and onions were particularly prized. The locations where they grew were remembered and noted. Wild pears, bird cherries, mushrooms, berries, various roots, and tubers were consumed. Mongol children learned from an early age to distinguish edible plants. This knowledge remained with them as they became warriors. It is important to note that Mongol armies often took sheep with them on campaign, not vast herds, but enough so that each unit of 10 men, an arban, had constant access to milk and occasional access to meat. The sheep moved with the army, grazing alongside the horses, providing a renewable food source. Putting all of this together, we see a system. Warriors carried a 3 to 4 week supply of emergency rations in a 20-pound bag. This was supplemented by air rag from their mares, hunting, foraging, and sheep accompanying the army. During rapid marches, when speed was critical, they could drink their horses' blood. The result was an army capable of operating for 120 days or more without external resupply. That is, 4 months. European armies depleted their supplies in 2 to 3 weeks and were forced to stop for replenishment. 4 months of continuous operations without supply lines. 4 months of appearing where there was grass, moving faster than messages, striking before defenders could mobilize. 4 months of warfare that proved impossible for anyone observing it. And all of this was based on the light footprint of living off the land and an understanding that mobility and endurance were more important than comfort. The Mongols ate simply. They ate frugally by the standards of settled civilizations, but they ate constantly from a dozen different sources, none of which required slowing down or creating vulnerable supply columns that could be attacked by enemies. In a world where every other army was chained to its logistics, the Mongols figured out how to break that chain. If you're starting to understand why this was revolutionary, why it changed warfare in a way that European and Chinese commanders couldn't counter, then hit the like button right now, because we're going to delve into how the Mongols organized this system on a massive scale. And this is where it gets truly impressive. Having a system that works for 100 warriors is one thing. Making that system function for 100,000 warriors across an entire continent is quite another. The Mongols solved this task with an organization that was both simple and complex. It all began with the decimal system. 10 warriors formed an arban. 10 arbans formed a jagan of 100 men. 10 jagans made up a mingan of 1,000. 10 mingans formed a tumen of 10,000 men. Everything was based on tens, which made the mathematics understandable and the command structure clear. But here's what made it work for logistics. Each unit was self-sufficient. An arban of 10 men had its own tent, its own supplies, its own sheep. They hunted together, foraged together, camped together. If an arban needed to detach from the main force and operate independently for weeks, they could. They had everything they needed. Move up to a jagan, and you have 100 men who could detach and conduct independent operations. A mingan of 1,000 men was a fully formed military unit with officers, scouts, logistical personnel, and a tumen of 10,000 men was effectively a small army in itself. And this modular structure meant that Mongol forces didn't have to move as a single mass. They could spread out based on the availability of grass and water, each unit finding its own pastures, its own game, its own fodder. They would then reconvene for battles, coordinating the convergence of multiple columns over hundreds of miles. To understand how complex this coordination was, consider what happened in 1241. In that year, the Mongols invaded Hungary and Poland. Batu Khan led the main force into Hungary from the east. Simultaneously, a separate Mongol army under Kaidan struck Poland from the north. A third force under Orda moved into Transylvania from the south. All 3 columns, it is claimed, moved through different landscapes, followed different routes, and encountered different enemies, but arrived at their objectives almost simultaneously. As per a plan developed months in advance, the Hungarians and Poles, seeing separate Mongol detachments, assumed they were unrelated raids. But this was not the case. They were facing a coordinated campaign spanning a front of over 1,000 miles, and this was happening while other Mongol forces were simultaneously conducting operations in Korea on the opposite side of Asia. One empire, a single military system operating at a scale that defied the understanding of command and control at the time. How did they achieve such coordination? First, through planning. Mongol campaigns began long before armies marched. They began with years of reconnaissance. Before any major invasion, the Mongols didn't just send a few spies for a few months. They organized reconnaissance operations that lasted for years. Before invading Europe, Mongol agents spent decades mapping roads, identifying crossing points, locating pastures, and assessing the military strength of each kingdom. They interviewed merchants traveling to these regions and interrogated captured soldiers. As a result, they created a picture of the terrain and the enemy that was more complete than what most European kingdoms knew about their own lands. When Batu invaded Hungary, he knew exactly where the grass was. His agents had spent years confirming the state of pastures. This is where the genius of the system lies. The Mongols did not conquer the land and then think about how to supply their army. They determined how to supply the army and then conquered the land. In his chronicle, the Hungarian magister Roger, who witnessed the 1241 invasion, described how the Mongols first approached the Carpathian Mountains, a natural barrier protecting Hungary, but then retreated 4 to 5 days' journey. Roger explicitly notes that they left the border regions of Hungary untouched, so that upon their return, the grass would be fresh and abundant. This is an example of planning. It is a deep understanding of logistics that allows for the conscious preservation of pasture land for a campaign that is still weeks away from commencing. Another element of coordination was the YAM system. This was a network of postal stations spaced at regular intervals across Mongol-controlled territory. Each station had fresh horses, supplies, and couriers. A message could travel from Mongolia to Eastern Europe in a matter of weeks, faster than any other communication system in the medieval world. The YAM system meant that although Mongol armies were spread out over hundreds of miles, operating independently, they could still receive orders, send reports, and coordinate actions. It was the skeleton of communication that held the dispersed empire together. Crucially, however, Mongol armies did not rely on the YAM for supplies. This is the key difference. European armies required open supply lines or they starved. Mongol armies used the YAM for information and coordination. For sustenance, they relied on horse pastures and hunting. If the YAM was disrupted, Mongol armies could still operate. They would simply operate blind, without centralized coordination. Even this was quite manageable due to how Mongol commanders were trained. From childhood, Mongol warriors learned to read the terrain, understand weather patterns, identify water sources and pastures. This was not specialized knowledge held only by officers. Every Mongol learned this because survival on the steppe demanded it. When a 1,000-man unit detached from the main force, the commander did not need a field manual, a quartermaster, or a weather forecast. He knew how to read the land. He knew where to find grass, how much was there, how long it would take to deplete it. He knew how to regulate his pace of movement so as not to exhaust his horses. He knew all this because he grew up in a culture where this knowledge was fundamental. Scale this up to 100,000 warriors, and you have an army where every unit could operate independently. Every commander instinctively understood logistics, and the entire army could spread out and reconvene based on the demands of the terrain and supplies, rather than the limitations of roads and depots. Compare this to European armies, where the supply system was centralized, vulnerable, and slow. Cut the supply line of a European army, and you paralyze the entire force. Disrupt the communication of a Mongol army, and you only inconvenience them. The Mongols could travel 60 to 100 miles a day. European armies covered 10 to 20 miles on a good day. Mongol forces could divide into 5 separate columns, each moving independently. European armies had to remain concentrated around their baggage trains. The Mongols could appear in places they considered impregnable, arrive a week early, and attack from directions that seemed impossible. And it all came down to grass. It was the need to disperse in search of pastures that formed the basis of their tactical scheme. The modular principle of organization allowed them to disperse effectively. Training from childhood ensured that every warrior understood and could apply this system. The YAM, in turn, united all the elements without creating dependence. It was a brilliant solution. Its sophistication was utterly beyond the comprehension of contemporaries because it did not align with their notions of sophisticated logistics. To the outside observer, it looked chaotic, even primitive, but it was not. The system was perfectly adapted for conducting maneuver warfare across the territory of the largest empire in history. Let me show you how this system operated through the example of one campaign, the Battle of the Kalka River. In 1223, General Subutai had 20,000 Mongols. Genghis Khan had ordered him to conduct reconnaissance west of Mongol-controlled territories, scout the lands beyond the Caspian Sea, and gather intelligence on potential future conquests. Subutai, with his 20,000 warriors, embarked on a reconnaissance military expedition that lasted several years and covered thousands of miles. By 1223, Subutai found himself in the Russian steppes. Russian princes had been receiving reports of Mongol raids for months. Unfamiliar horsemen appeared, attacked border towns, and disappeared back into the steppes. The Russians sought advice from the Cumans, a Turkic nomadic people who had experience with the Mongols. Together, they amassed 80,000 warriors, 4 times the strength of the Mongol army. The coalition was confident of victory. They had overwhelming numerical superiority. They were fighting on their own territory, giving them an advantage. They had established supply lines connecting them to Russian cities, and they faced an enemy who, by all rules of military science, should have run out of provisions weeks earlier. The coalition forces advanced. Subutai's Mongols retreated. For over a week, the Mongols systematically retreated, staying just ahead of the pursuing coalition forces. To the Russian commanders, it looked exactly as they expected. Barbarian raiders, outnumbered and outgunned, fleeing to avoid annihilation. But as they pursued, the coalition began to find something curious. Small groups of Mongol shepherds with their animals, seemingly abandoned in the haste of retreat. Left behind provisions, isolated detachments of warriors that appeared disorganized. The coalition forces stretched out as they advanced. Different princes commanded different contingents. All of them followed the Mongols deeper into the steppe. What the Russians failed to notice was that the Mongols were changing fresh horses every few hours. They subsisted on kumis and dried provisions. They hunted on the move. Each night, they made camp, let their horses graze, and rested fully. Each day, they covered another 50 to 60 miles. The coalition troops, meanwhile, found their supply wagons unable to keep up. Their supply lines grew thinner with every mile. Their horses, fed on grain, showed fatigue. The various contingents of the coalition lost cohesion, stretching out for miles across the steppe as faster elements moved ahead and slower ones lagged behind. Subutai was luring them into the perfect place for annihilation. At the Kalka River, the Mongols ceased their retreat. They turned and accepted battle. The Russian forces were now stretched over an immense distance, divided into numerous columns that could not support each other. The leading elements of the coalition made contact with the Mongols and thought they had finally caught up with the raiders. Then the trap snapped shut. The Mongols who had been retreating were the bait. Other Mongol detachments, which had been moving parallel to the coalition's advance but concealed by the terrain, struck from the flanks. The coalition forces found themselves attacked from multiple directions by an enemy who should have been exhausted and demoralized but was instead fresh and acting in concert. The battle lasted only one day. By sunset, the Russo-Cuman coalition was annihilated. 80,000 men were destroyed by 20,000. The surviving princes were captured. Subutai reportedly ordered them placed under planks and slowly suffocated while the Mongols stood or sat on these planks during a victory feast. The Mongols had no supply wagons to protect. They carried no siege equipment, no heavy baggage to slow them down. They lived off the land they traversed. They used their superior mobility to control the tempo of the campaign, luring the enemy into terrain favorable to Mongol tactics. And when they finally accepted battle, they did so on their terms against an exhausted and divided enemy. This was the Mongol system in action, precisely as designed, and it worked equally successfully in Russia, in China, in Persia, and in Central Asia. The details changed, the commanders changed, but the fundamental system remained the same. Move fast, live light, use mobility to offset numerical superiority, let the enemy exhaust themselves trying to keep up, and when you engage, do so on ground of your choosing, with forces of your own selection. News of the Kalka River disaster eventually reached European courts. The reports were incredible. How could 20,000 men defeat 80,000? The explanations offered by contemporaries were strange. Some claimed demons fought with the Mongols, others that they used magic. A third insisted they must have had secret reinforcements that were not reported. The true explanation was simpler and more terrifying. The Mongols had solved the problem of military logistics in a way no one else had even conceived of as possible. They had created an army capable of operating for months without a supply line, moving with almost supernatural speed, and coordinating actions across distances that should have made communication impossible, and they were just getting started. The 20,000 warriors who destroyed the coalition at the Kalka River were merely a reconnaissance force. The main Mongol army was still in Mongolia and China, preparing for conquests that would eventually cover 1/9 of the Earth's landmass. The grass-powered empire was just beginning to show what it was capable of. But the Mongol system was not magic, and it had real limitations. To understand these limitations, we need to talk about Hungary in 1242. The Mongol invasion of Hungary in 1241 was one of the empire's greatest campaigns. Batu Khan led some 130,000 soldiers in a sweeping operation that crushed Hungarian and Polish resistance. By the winter of 1241, the Mongols controlled much of Hungary. The capital was theirs. Organized army resistance had been suppressed. By all accounts, Hungary had been conquered. Then, in the spring of 1242, the Mongols departed Hungary and retreated into the Russian steppes. Historians have debated for centuries why. The traditional explanation was that Subutai, the great Khan ruling the Mongol Empire, died at the end of 1241, and Batu needed to return due to a succession crisis. This was only part of the reason, but recent research, analyzing dendrochronology data and modern climate records, has revealed something else. The weather had changed. From 1238 to 1241, Hungary experienced unusually warm and dry summers. This meant abundant grass. Mongol horses grazed easily. The vast herds accompanying the army found ample fodder. The entire logistical system functioned smoothly. Then, 1242 brought cold, wet conditions. The winter was harsh, and when spring arrived, the thaw turned the Hungarian plain into a swamp. The pastures were flooded. The areas that had served for grazing were now damp, muddy tracts where horses struggled to find food. Contemporary reports note that in late spring 1242, the Mongols stopped feeding prisoners anything but meager scraps. A Hungarian observer reported that starvation was even spreading among the Mongol troops. Archaeological and climate data confirm this. The conditions that favored the Mongol invasion in 1241 had changed by 1242. Here's the key point. Mongol sources clearly note that they did not store fodder for their horses. They let their horses graze freely on available pastures. When sufficient grass was not available, when horses could not find adequate grazing, the entire system collapsed. Mongol mobility decreased. Their military effectiveness diminished, and the advantage that made them unstoppable vanished. They retreated not because they were militarily defeated, but because the ecological conditions no longer supported their operational system. This reveals a fundamental limitation. The Mongol military system absolutely depended on pastures. In terrain where grass was abundant and accessible, they were nearly invincible. In terrain without grass, they were paralyzed. This explains their failure in Vietnam. The Mongols invaded Vietnam 3 times in 1258, 1285, and from 1287 to 1288. All 3 invasions failed, and the 3rd invasion ended in disaster at the Bac Dung River, which you may have heard me discuss before. Why did they fail? Because Vietnam was not a steppe, but tropical jungle and rice paddies. There were no pastures for horses. The advantage of Mongol cavalry vanished. Their advantage in mobility disappeared. They were forced to fight as infantry in unfamiliar terrain against an enemy using guerrilla tactics. The Vietnamese employed scorched earth tactics. They burned their crops and disappeared into the jungle. The Mongols captured Hanoi 3 times, and each time found it empty, just as the Russians had found their cities empty. But in Russia, there was grass beyond the cities. Mongol horses could graze, and the army could sustain itself. In Vietnam, there was jungle. Horses suffered, warriors suffered, diseases spread. Heat stroke was a constant occurrence. The 3rd invasion in 1287 to 1288 involved over 100,000 soldiers, one of the largest Mongol campaigns in history. Despite all of this, they were still defeated at the Kalka River by wooden stakes in the river with tidal currents. Strategically, however, they had already lost the moment they invaded territory that deprived them of their logistical advantages. The situation with Japan was similar. The Mongols attempted to invade Japan twice, in 1274 and 1281. Both times massive fleets were involved, carrying Mongol and Chinese troops. Both times ended in disaster. The problem was that it was impossible to transport enough horses by sea, and even if it had been possible, where would they graze on islands covered in rice paddies and forests? The Mongol cavalry system that dominated continental warfare proved unsuitable for amphibious invasions. When typhoons destroyed the invasion fleets, it was almost a relief. The campaigns were already failing for logistical reasons. This is important because it shows that the Mongols were not invincible. They were perfectly adapted to steppe warfare. Their system worked magnificently in the grassy corridor from Hungary to Korea, but it had strict boundaries defined by terrain and climate. The pattern is clear. Where there was abundant grass, the Mongols prevailed. Where grass was scarce or inaccessible, they faced difficulties or defeat. The Gobi Desert was a barrier. Forests were a barrier. Jungles were a barrier. Mountains were passable if there were high-altitude pastures. Oceans were impassable. Even their successes had limits. After the Mongols conquered China and established the Yuan dynasty, maintaining the empire required adaptation to settled life. Kublai, ruling from Beijing, had to maintain a large hunting preserve with pastures near his capital, specifically so that the Mongol elite would not lose their horsemanship skills. This is indicative of how fundamental grass and horses were to Mongol identity. The empire eventually fractured, in part because governing settled agricultural societies required different skills and systems than conquering steppes. The logistical advantages that made the Mongols invincible in conquest became irrelevant in governance. None of this diminishes their achievements. It simply shows that their success was based on a specific system, suited for specific conditions. Understanding the limitations helps us understand why this system was so effective within those boundaries. The Mongols created the largest contiguous land empire in history not in spite of their limitations, but by understanding them perfectly and building a military system that turned those limitations into advantages. Let's return to where we began. You are those Russian commanders in 1223, watching the Mongols and trying to figure out where they got their food, or the Chinese, Persian, and European observers who saw these nomadic herders and dismissed them as primitive. Everything these observers scoffed at turned out to be precisely what made the Mongols win. They mocked the Mongols for drinking horse blood like savages. But drinking horse blood meant a Mongol detachment could operate for up to 10 days in terrain where any other army would starve. It meant they could traverse a desert or a barren steppe where their enemies thought they could not possibly go. It meant they had a mobile food supply that moved with them and could not be intercepted or captured. They laughed at the small Mongol horses, considering them weak and inferior. European knights rode massive war horses, powerful animals that looked far more imposing. But these imposing horses required 9 kilograms of grain a day. They couldn't graze on steppe grass. They needed stables and cold weather. They were too valuable to risk on long campaigns. Mongol horses ate any grass they found. They lived outdoors in temperatures that would kill European horses. They could cover 100 to 160 kilometers a day. They provided milk. They provided blood. And their upkeep cost virtually nothing. Small did not mean weak. Small meant perfect. They laughed at the Mongols for their lack of supply lines, their lack of logistical infrastructure, but the absence of supply lines meant the absence of vulnerabilities. European armies could be starved into submission by cutting off their provisions. The Mongols could not be starved. They would simply hunt more, forage more, draw blood from more horses. They would slow down a little, but they would not stop. They laughed at the Mongols for their primitive nomadic lifestyle, but that lifestyle was the most effective military training program ever devised. From the age of 3, every Mongol learned to ride. From the age of 5, they learned to shoot. They learned to read the terrain, understand the weather, survive in harsh conditions. By the time a Mongol warrior was 16, he possessed skills that European knights took decades to master, if they ever did. The nomadic lifestyle that looked primitive was, in fact, a sophisticated adaptation to one of the harshest environments on Earth. The Mongols were not primitive, they were specialized, and their specialization translated directly into military superiority. They ridiculed Mongol culture, Mongol food, Mongol customs, The fermented mare's milk that Europeans found repulsive formed the basis of Mongol logistics. The blood drinking, which appeared barbaric, was tactical genius. The undersized horses, looking unsuitable for anything that mattered in steppe warfare, outperformed European war horses. The supreme irony is that the most complex military logistical systems of the 10th century, those of China and Europe with their supply depots and organized infrastructure, were defeated by a system that looked primitive but was actually far more advanced. Advanced doesn't mean complex. Advanced means effective, and the Mongol system was devastatingly effective. Let me give you the numbers again so you can appreciate the scale of what happened. Mongol forces could operate for 120 days without resupply. European armies managed 2 to 3 weeks. Mongol cavalry covered 60 to 100 miles a day. European armies covered 10 to 20. Mongol forces could divide into 5 or more independent columns and reconvene at a designated time and place hundreds of miles away. European armies had to move as a single, concentrated mass. The Mongols conquered an empire of 9 million square miles, the largest contiguous land empire in history. They did it in about 70 years. They faced every major military power in the known world and defeated almost all of them. And they did it while drinking horse blood and fermented mare's milk, riding undersized horses across the steppes, living on a diet that Europeans considered fit only for barbarians. The civilized world with its agriculture, cities, and complex logistics was conquered by nomads who seemed to have nothing, yet had everything. They had mobility, they had endurance, they had adaptation to their environment. They had a system that worked. Sometimes experts are wrong, sometimes conventional wisdom is fatally flawed, and sometimes the people considered primitive are actually operating at a level of sophistication that the civilized cannot even recognize. The Mongols proved this. They rode out of the steppes on grass-eating horses, carrying 20-pound supplies, and crushed every empire they met, not with better technology, not with superior numbers, but with a better understanding of what truly mattered in war. Napoleon, 500 years later, would say that an army marches on its stomach. The Mongols proved that an army marches on grass, on mare's milk, and on the willingness to do whatever it takes to keep moving. If you found this story as captivating as I did, if you're starting to look at history differently, then I ask you to do one thing right now. Hit that subscribe button, because I have more stories like this, more examples of people who succeeded by ignoring conventional wisdom, by turning their perceived weaknesses into strengths, by understanding their environment better than anyone could imagine. This story is not just about the Mongols. It's about how we assess capabilities, limitations, and what makes something advanced or primitive. Military theorists of the 11th century all agreed on the fundamentals of logistics. You needed supply lines, you needed infrastructure, you needed organized resupply. These weren't opinions. They were facts validated by centuries of military history. Then came the Mongols and proved that all these facts were wrong. Or rather, they were facts only in a certain context. Change the context, change the environment, and the facts change. European logistics worked perfectly for European warfare. Armies fought in agricultural lands, besieged castles, operated on established roads. Chinese logistics worked perfectly for defending a settled empire. But neither system could adapt to steppe warfare, where grass replaced roads and mobility replaced infrastructure. The Mongols were not smarter than Europeans or Chinese. They were adapted differently, and that adaptation, which looked like a weakness from the outside, was a devastating advantage in the environment in which they operated. This pattern repeats throughout history. A simple solution often trumps a complex one. Not always, not everywhere. But under the right conditions, simplicity defeats complexity, adaptation defeats innovation, and understanding your environment defeats imposing your expectations upon it. Think about modern parallels. Small, agile companies often outmaneuver massive corporations. Guerrilla marketing reaches audiences ignoring traditional advertising. Remote work has proven more effective than many thought possible by eliminating the commuting infrastructure we assumed was necessary. The lesson taught by the Mongols in the 10th century remains relevant. Your limitations can be advantages if you understand them correctly. Your weaknesses can be strengths in the right context, and conventional wisdom can be spectacularly wrong. In 1223, the Russians, looking at the Mongols, saw only an army with no provisions, doomed to starve within days. Their military wisdom told them the Mongols would inevitably lose. The Mongols, assessing the same situation, saw endless steppes, thousands of horses, and complete freedom of movement. Their assumptions were entirely different, and, as history showed, led to the conquest of half the known world. What are we overlooking today? What advantages are we ignoring because they don't fit our preconceived notions of how the world should work? What seemingly primitive approaches will actually prove more effective? I don't have ready answers, but I see this pattern clearly, and it states, somewhere right now, someone is being underestimated due to their unconventional methods, the apparent simplicity of their system, or their deviation from accepted norms. And like the Mongols, we will likely not realize the scale of what is happening until it is too late to do anything about it. Let's recall that morning in 1223 when Russian commanders saw 20,000 Mongols on the horizon with no visible supplies. Where is their provision? They wondered. The answer was everywhere. In the grass their horses ate, in the milk those horses provided, in the blood that could be drunk in extremis, in the game that could be hunted, in the dried rations of each warrior. This entire complex system was honed by centuries of nomadic life. The Mongols did not require food supplies in the way the Russians understood them. They completely redefined the very concept of army provision. Traditional armies either carried supplies with them or delivered them from afar. The Mongol army was its own supply system. The horse, serving a transport function, also served as a food source. Warriors, while fighting, simultaneously hunted and foraged. The nomadic lifestyle that looked utterly primitive was, in reality, the most effective military logistical system ever created. So, there's the answer to why the Mongol army didn't need traditional food supplies as it conquered the world. Because it needed them. It simply got them from sources no one else even considered. They turned their way of life into their way of waging war. Their perceived weaknesses became their greatest advantages. They understood their environment so deeply that they could operate where other armies simply wouldn't survive. An empire on grass, an army powered by photosynthesis, fermented kumis, and the occasional sip of horse blood. It sounds incredible. It seems like it shouldn't work. Yet, this army conquered 9 million square miles and changed the course of human history. So, if you are now looking at military logistics differently, at what makes a system truly advanced, at how perceived primitives can outdo supposed advanced civilizations, do me a favor, leave a comment. Tell me what other examples of this you've observed. At what other moments in history have outsiders won by rewriting the rules? What modern examples mirror what the Mongols did? And if you want more stories about people who succeeded by defying conventional wisdom, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because history is full of these moments. Moments when experts were tragically wrong. Moments when the barbarians at the gate turned out to be more advanced than the civilization within the walls. The Mongols proved that the world is conquered not by the most sophisticated logistics, but by the logistics that best fit the conditions in which you are fighting. Thank you for watching.